All right, welcome everyone. This is my friend David Flores. He's been a contributor of the Symbolic World blog from pretty much the very start. I think you published like your first article on Orns, like maybe a few months in. You've been also helping with editing ever since then, and you published an article a few years ago titled "Perilous Ascent: An Exploration of Actaeon and Revolution." In 2021. And since I edited this and published it on the blog, it always stayed at the back of my mind as a good example of how to do a symbolic interpretation. So just wanted to have a chat with you about it and yeah, get people looking at the article.
Oh, well, thanks. It's fun to get as high praise from you because I really respect your work. Um, well, I don't really know where to start. I guess uh, maybe. So I think what happened was my first article with like horns and stuff. That was kind of Jonathan had just been doing the kind of symbolic interpretations, and he'd kind of take one or two things and just talk about how they uh, what they would represent in different stories and things like that. And so the Horn article was kind of like my first attempt at that. And then I think when I look back, the Actaeon article is almost exactly a year after that I wrote it. So what at a certain point, I think you start to look at the stories. You're really interested in that, and all that kind of stuff is really fascinating. But if you uh, other than just kind of a mental exercise, like if you're actually trying to incorporate it into your life, you have to really like take it seriously and see how each of those things can um, how these symbols are in our lives and how they're a good frame for navigating the world. And that article in particular was like my I think I was at that point and I was like, okay, well, how can I take one story and push it as far as I can at as many different levels? Because Jonathan's always talking about that, like at this level, and he kind of jumps from the individual to the collective. And so I really set out to like try and push the idea of revolution as far as I could, grounded within that particular story, because it's a very rich story as for that.
Yeah, and I could tell that you had thought about this because um, not only you talk about it at several layers, you also go through it very systematically. So you start from like the individual and then you work your way up until the cosmic layer. And that's not something that I see everyone doing. I think often when people do a symbolic interpretation, it's going to be fairly intuitive, where like they're gonna list a lot of like occurrences of the same pattern in different places, but it's not going to be as systematic. So I could tell reading the article that you had taken the time to think about it, and because of that, it makes the article very clear. I think maybe a good place to go next would be to tell the story of Actaeon, and then we can try to
Right.
go through some of those layers, and we'll get more into the method, I think, as we go through.
Sure. So if I'm going to give a short summary, Actaeon is the grandson of, I think, the founder of Thebes. He is a hunter, and he's with the hunting party one day, and they're super successful at their hunt. And when he kind of breaks away from his hunting party, he goes into the woods and he stumbles upon, depending on if it's a Greek or Roman myth you're reading, Diana or Artemis. She's naked, and he is exposed to her in this way, and she's not really happy about it at all. She flings water in his face, and he transforms into a half man, a hybrid deer kind of creature, and his own hunting hounds attack him and kill him. And so that's kind of the short version of the myth.
Yeah, and you already mentioned like a few versions in your telling of the story, and I think that's a good aspect also to bring up in the method because you you identify a pattern, the pattern of revolution, and you trace it out at different layers in the story. Also, you give examples that are just not in the story, just like other examples
Yeah.
of the same pattern to show that it's a real pattern. But what you also do that I don't see people do very often is that you take like if when you're looking for a pattern at a certain layer, you'll look for different versions of the same myth to see if like you can find an occurrence of the pattern at a certain layer in one version of the myth. And there's a few layers where that works, which I don't see that many people do. So that's
Yeah,
like
I
another
think
aspect of the method.
yeah, and I think some of the myths I think tend to help with that because those stories are told and retold um, in ways that aren't like nowadays. Like if you take I don't know like Snow White, I guess it's kind of a topical one because it's so like momentarily specific. Um, it's hard to like take it and compare it to two things when you're looking for a specific pattern. The kind of when I look at the different translations, they all have the same basic structure, but the kind of surrounding details unveil that different that pattern of revolution at different levels. And so I think probably a lot of the older myths probably tend to the ones that have those kind of retellings that are not just they've been kept. So it's not just that the myth itself has been preserved, but different tellings of the myth have also kind of continued on. I think probably because it's such a potent symbol
Yeah, I
message.
would I would have to think about why we do that for certain stories but not others. Like in the gospel, like the gospels are like different
Yeah,
ways of
very
telling the same story. And in the Old Testament, sometimes you have that too. Like I don't remember, like Chronicles and Kings, maybe. There's like
yeah,
a few times where you have, or Maccabees 1 and 2, like they're different tellings of the same story. They're very different tellings of the same story. So we do that sometimes, but not always. Even I'm trying to think of like reboots, maybe as a way of like people doing that even recently. Like there have been many reboots of Spider-Man in the last 20 years,
yeah,
and like they tell the story in different ways. Um, but yeah, I think it's different now because it's like we don't see them as living like in parallel typically, I think.
yeah,
Maybe like they did that with the Spider-Man multiverse thing, but I haven't like looked into it enough to know if like there's
yeah.
something meaningful there.
And it's something I haven't really thought that much about either. I just think I was just thinking about it from the ease of trying to identify and kind of like do like a systematic look at a particular symbol. Um, yeah, and I don't. I think maybe like in the case of the Spider-Man things, it also seems like there's a semi-comic competition. You know, like it's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
like they don't. Um, it's not that they're. It's kind of like a preferential thing. Like which one do you like the best? There's no like winner, I guess. But even then, it's not. Yeah, it's just different somehow. I'd have to think about it some more about.
yeah. Um, but yeah, going back to the story, so the
Yeah.
pattern that you identify is the pattern of revolution, and you go through it at different layers. So the first one is the individual level. So what it means to, well, maybe I can let you describe it since you wrote the article.
Oh, well, I started with the individuals. I think that's the most, pertinent. I mean, really, like if you think about things at a cosmic level or, a social political level, we don't really live in those levels to a certain degree where we can have as much of an effect on it as our individual lives. And so I think it's really, that's kind of, that was also like the root of what I was trying to get at. Like how is this symbol, how is this, 'cause the symbol's almost like a frame, I think, and how to, look at a particular situation or particular patterns in your life. And so if this pattern is true, I should be able to see it, identify it, and figure it out. And what matters most is what matters to me individually. So I started with the individual. And then I tried to kind of go from individual upward. And so in bigger and bigger units. And so from the individual, I went to, I think, the family, from the family to the kind of communal. And I don't remember if I can't remember exactly all the strata, but I know I had the socio-political, I think the cosmic at the top of that. And I'm sure there's many more different ways. I was also trying to, I was a bit more presumptuous, but I thought maybe that kind of looking at it through those ways, if enough people are looking at the articles, it might be a useful language to kind of talk about these different levels. Oftentimes we just say like, oh, the next level or oh, this level. Cosmic level is really obvious. A lot of people, like Jonathan's talked about that, but the other ones don't really have as much of a vocabulary for them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I think it works. And also the fact that you go through it layer by layer makes the article very clear and compelling, I find. So at the individual level, like one way you see it is that the passions of Actaeon get the better of him. So there are tellings of the story. That's one place where you look into different like tellings of the story. In some tellings, like it says that he's obsessed by the hunt in a non-healthy way. In some versions, he's like comparing himself to Artemis or Diana, and like he's trying to go too far, let's say. And then these two things will combine in him like getting attacked by his passions, by his dogs, you can say. It's like if you try to reach too high, then what's below is gonna devour you. So you'll see this pattern of your passions, let's say, revolting against your like taking the power over you, which is a revolution happening within you as an individual.
Right. And yeah, and for him, the one particular version that stuck out with me always is that it said that the hills turned red. So it's like he's killing so many things. It's such an excess. And I think in the article I compare it to, I mean, now we're recording this around Easter, and so everybody's got lots of Easter candy around. So like, oh, I ate too much chocolate, and you lost your own self control in that moment. And so there's that revolutionary aspect that just happens within you. And so that's the kind of I'm sure there's plenty more examples, but I think that was a very common and easy one for people to relate to.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It makes sense. And then you talk about the familial, and that's also another place where you bring up different versions of the story to show like how revolution affects like a certain layer because there are familial elements. As you said, Actaeon is the grandson of the founder of Thebes, and there's distress in the family that happens with this revolution that Actaeon goes through. So there's like a breakup within the hierarchy at the familial level, in addition to what happens at the individual level first.
Yeah, and it's really quite. I mean, a lot. This story is pretty much kind of like a negative view of evolution. There's good examples we can talk about later, but you really see how it just kind of washes through uh, once you start going up the levels. And on your own, it's not such a big deal. It really kind of affects you, but for him, his family's distraught. Even the dogs, there's certain telling where the dogs are weeping once they kind of realize what they've done. But it's also interesting too how it's almost mirrored up all the way through the story. Like what's happening with him is also happening in those people around him, or the dogs. So it's really yeah, it's really salient.
Yeah, you have it like at the two extremes of the family because you have the grandfather who's like the founder of Thebes. He's distressed, but so are the dogs that are very like at the bottom of all of this. And they would normally be held together by like Actaeon in the middle. That's what he should have been doing, but that's not what happened. So then both sides end up being in distress. Like I guess the grandfather because he has no like he has lost the heir that he had in Actaeon, and the dogs have no master, so they just like become
Yeah,
chaotic.
yeah, he had a lot of. There's an implication that he was very favored by Cad. I think it's Cadmus. He's not. He's the heir, and so the hope, in the future of everything. But then he's also there's that very immediate connection of grandfather who loves his grandson.
Yeah, I wonder if there would be if we looked if we could find some kind of implication that in in like grasping too high and like doing an improper ascent towards Artemis, if there's also a kind of improper ascent that Actaeon did towards his grandfather.
I would imagine. I don't know. Uh, it's been a while since I've read the stories, but I don't recall there being any kind of like official like he's the king, he's the heir. I don't know if I mean his grandfather's still alive, so presumably the grandfather's in charge. So there might be some of that of like trying to. I hadn't thought about this, but trying to skip the level, right? Like just surpass his grandfather. I mean, how much of that, and this is the other interesting thing, is like how much of it is his intent, is his intent versus him just acts stumbling upon a situation that's beyond his means, and instead of um, approaching carefully and in humility, he kind of does the opposite. He's not. Uh, I don't know. You could argue that there's no time for apology, but there's still just something about the fact that like he ended up in this situation and uh, how it was improper, like just all together. So I wouldn't. I think you could say that there is probably some, especially if like when the versions where he's trying to make her his consort. Like I mean, that's kind of super ridiculous, even especially in a pagan sense. Like I mean, could you imagine? Like you're a Greek, I'm gonna make Artemis my wife, and
Yeah.
virgin huntress goddess. Yeah,
It's interestingly ambiguous. But because there's also other tellings where it seems like he's like hunting too much, and like at some point he just stumbles upon Artemis without like it being voluntary, but it still happens. And so there's this kind of um un unbalance that we don't like know initially at the beginning of the story, like because if it's tilted like too high or too low, we don't know if it's because like he's trying to reach too high for Artemis or if it's because he's like reaching too low and just hunting too much, following his passions too much. Could be either of those two or a combination. It's left interestingly ambiguous.
yeah. And I suppose you could kind of say maybe if it's the hunting too much, in a way, it's kind of justice, like a reordering, where he's not doing what he's supposed to. But as you know, we'll get to that. I think that's one of the next layers. But yeah, either that or he's reaching too high, which is a revolutionary act in and of itself, trying to usurp his grandfather, Artemis.
Yeah. There's a kind of parallel to Moses and the burning bush, I think, going on there, where
Mm, yeah,
like Moses is taking care of his flock, and by accident he stumbles upon the burning bush. But there, it's okay for Moses because he remains humble. Um,
but he takes off his sandals, right? Like
yeah,
it's not. His approach to the burning bush is way different, and there's a lot of layers of humility there. He's certainly repeats that he's not unworthy, especially once he's being spoken to.
yeah. I would have to think more about other aspects of the story, but like
I think
Moses,
that's a good exercise to do. I hadn't put those together, but I think that's a good one.
and even about the father figures, because like Moses is like orphaned like when he's in Egypt, but he gets adopted by his father-in-law in a way. He becomes this
Yeah,
kind of mentor and he works for him. So there's I mean this is a kind of humility too, to like leave Egypt, start a new family, subject yourself to your father-in-law. Um yeah, I would have to think more about the parallels, but there's something also about the father figures. Um Anyway, that's so that's the familial level, and then you talk about the socio-political, and you bring up an interesting aspect of the story because you mentioned earlier that Actaeon is royalty from the line of the founder of Thebes, and the dogs often have names that come from other Greek city-states. So there's a way in which like he should be dominating the other cities, but he ends up getting dominated by them.
yeah. I was surprised to find that aspect out. I just saw this list of names. I'm like, what's going on? And then you see you see Sparta in there and stuff, and it's just like, oh, okay, I get what. But and the fact that they're dogs, I think, is also telling of what Thebes is. What Thebes thought of the rest of them. But yeah, that I thought was really fascinating, and it really does add that layer of kind of. Yeah, and I don't know the history of Thebes and all the interactions between the Greek city states, but I don't. I know the name, but usually it's Athens you hear, so I don't know how it all shook out historically. But if this is one of those kind of myths where it's kind of recounting that, it might be.
Yeah, and then I mean it's a powerful image because he's trying to reach in a way for or he stumbles upon the Greek goddess, and because of that he loses the position that he has towards the other Greeks. So like he ends up like Thebes as a whole ends up like getting dominated by other Greek city-states because of this. So it's yeah, uh, powerful symbolism.
Yeah, and I think the there's also if you think about him killing all the animals, and if you look at that particular image for that particular level of sociopolitical, if all the animals are the rest of the world that Thebes is supposed to be putting in order, then you start having a whole different layer of the domination of a culture over others improperly, right? Like just blood and guts and war and everything. And so then that's where I said you see it's almost in some ways, looking back on it, you have a situation where depending on the version, it's almost like a form of justice. He's not doing what he's supposed to, so the next layers putting it in order, and he's kind of getting it from both sides, right? Like it's the bottom is getting, he's getting uh, justice from the top, and then a sort of justice from the bottom.
Yeah, this is making me want to think about like ways that the same pattern could have happened like at those layers, less mythologically maybe. So like we can even go back to the previous layer, the familial. Maybe like if Actaeon was hunting too much, getting too attached to you can even see it both ways. Like either if he was too attached to like the pleasure of hunting, or if he was too in love with Artemis, the goddess of hunting, like in either ways, like maybe he was spending too much time there on hunting, becoming what he was hunting, becoming a stag, let's say, and not taking the place he was supposed to take in his family.
Yeah,
And that led to the ruptures we talked about earlier. So, like you could say, like even if let's say materially, that is what that happened. Like let's say that he was just spending too much time hunting and getting obsessed with the goddess of the hunt, and like becoming obsessed as a stag, let's say. Um, like it would still make sense, like as an analogy at least, to say that well, what was happening is that he became devoured by the hunt, and then his grandfather mourned him because they had like effectively lost the hire it was supposed to be, and so on. So you could like you could see why the mythological language would fit, even if it happened on a more natural level, let's say.
yeah. You could do a good analogy of like, if I play video games, uh, you know,
Yeah,
for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and on end, and I'm just obsessed with the victory I can get in a game. Well, you're chasing after victory, but if your family's you're disconnected from your family, so they suffer. You don't go to work, so then suddenly you're in trouble at work and you don't have a job. So you could kind of see how that the way he's aiming for Diana is not proper, and so his attention is in the wrong. His attention for the goal. His attention directed in the bent in the wrong direction for the goal he's trying to get.
yeah, yeah. And the image of the veil and nakedness is interesting too, because even if we take that example again of video games, it's getting obsessed by video games. Uh, there's a way in which like it's fine if like some people want to play video games a
Yeah,
little bit, like as long as they
right.
keep it somehow veiled, like a little bit at least, so they don't have like full access to the glory of video games. Like if like I don't think of a child like a 5-year-old who gets access to
Yeah,
all the video games in the world, like with no veil, that he might just do this for the rest of his life. That might be over.
yeah,
So like having this layer of protection is useful. It's not something you should be exposed to too early.
yeah. And I just pick video games. I think that's one that's there. But you could take like hunting. I mean, I've hunted in the past, so that can. But you can almost any hobby or pastime can kind of become an obsession, um, in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, and then so this was sort of at the familial level. But we can also think at other ways that the same pattern can happen at the socio-political level. If,
Mm.
as you started to talk about earlier, Actaeon is supposed to like dominate isn't the right word. Like you don't dominate your dogs, but let's say
Right.
you lead your dogs. So if Thebes is supposed to lead the other Greek city-states, and do productive things. Like hunting is a productive thing to feed the dogs, to feed like your own family, your city. So like there's and maybe go to war against non-Greeks. Like there's like this leadership role is perfectly fine. But if Actaeon become or if Thebes, you can say, if Thebes becomes obsessed by like taking over other cities, they become obsessed by. Well, in this case, it would be more Mars, like the god of war, let's say, than
Right.
Artemis. But it's still analogous. Like if they had like unveiled access to the god of war, and they just want to go to war with like all the other cities, at some point, what's probably gonna happen is that they will start eating each other. So Thebes will be devoured by the other Greek city-states, let's say. So um, if this is what had happened materially, it would still make sense in a mythological language, at least, to tell the
Yeah.
story that the stories typically said.
And there's a little bit of I hadn't given it much thought, but just talking with you, there's probably a little bit of something with not integrating the hunt properly, right? Because you think about if you're hunting or fishing, right? The, the end goal is to eat the animal that you kill. You know that you don't. Yeah, there's a trophy element to it and everything, but primarily it's you're getting food, and if you're just wholesale slaughtering thousands of animals where the hills are turning red, you're not integrating that properly. And then from the social political, like how a country leads, how a country deals with other countries economically, um, you know, are those things being integrated appropriately, and are you are those countries in right relationship with the other countries surrounding them to where there's a beneficial relationship. If you take the story at that level, clearly he wasn't doing that. It's all kind of slaughter and stuff. So.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point because there's a way in which like a city can eat other cities and do it in a way that's positive. Like it's possible that you civilize barbarians, let's say. Like this can be good. I think there have been instances of this. I think it's good that Europe was civilized by Christianity and well, actually, it's different because it wasn't through war, as far as I think. And I don't know enough about history to think of examples where this kind of integration happened well, in the way that, like, we can think of Actaeon leading his dogs to integrate other cities. But I think, yeah, I would have to think more about it. But I think that the broad pattern would be that if
Maybe
you,
something like the Silk Road might be like,
yeah,
like trade. I think trade's probably a good example because, yeah, I mean, there are lots of trade agreements that only benefit, but there's a lot of, I mean, humans have throughout history benefited greatly from trade, and so I think that's kind of a good way to look at it. I'm like you, I don't know enough about history and wars and all of that to know, go like, oh, well, this had a positive outcome in the long run or something. But I think trade's a pretty like the Silk Road's a really good example of how loads of different countries all mutually benefited from a trade.
yeah, yeah, I would have to think more about how it could connect to Actaeon leading his dogs. But yeah, I would have to think more about it. So this is the socio-political level, and then the last layer is the cosmic one, because the images are pretty strong there. There's water, there's the nakedness of Artemis, there's so like the transformation that Actaeon goes through. So there, maybe do you remember how you explained this level?
Well, yeah, I think the biggest thing was I did a drawing to the end of the article. It's pretty gruesome, but it's a gruesome topic, and I think the I really got an insight to a flood being like a revolution tied to the symbol of flood, and then with the fact that water is the key for the transformation in there, and how um, Actaeon the dogs are physically, you think about just immediately, dogs are a short animal compared to human standing, and then if he's on a horse, he's even higher up, so he's quite literally like the dogs are rising up. And then, I'm from Louisiana, and so I've been through, my lifetime, several different floods from hurricanes, and the kind of devastation that it brings along with it. It's really evident, I think, in the story. And so, from a cosmic level, and she's a goddess. So, uh, the fact that she's there, it's already a cosmic story because she's a goddess, right? And so I think the key with the water there, and then kind of, and when you hear like a lot of the revolutionary rhetoric, it's rise up, to overthrow. And so I think it's one of those things where it's symbolism happens, that kind of all kind of comes together.
Yeah, the point about water and flooding is a good one that it doesn't connect directly to me because it's not an issue in Canada. Like this kind of thing is very rare, but the image is useful that there's especially like if there's a goddess throwing water, like you can think of like really a flood happening.
And
Um,
she's in the water too. That's another thing. I haven't given much more. I mean, it's been years since I, wrote the article, but she's bathing and she's in water. Um, so I'd have to think about that more about what that means. But while she's not like a flood goddess, she is like part of this. Balancing nature, I guess, is another way to think about being the goddess of the hunt. And yeah, so the yeah, it was this is also one of the first times I had kind of realized like how a flood, um, it's a multivalent symbol, especially at the cosmic level. It doesn't just have to be water. The dogs are like water, and that they're these uh, really particular individual units that kind of come up. And I think there's a lot of similarities. You think about the flood, biblically. Um, all was You just have this lots of images of you have this lot of implication of bloodshed, and all men can only think of evil things like that. I think that's something to that effect. That's what Scripture says, and so
yeah,
the kind of idea of that, uh,
yeah, yeah,
yeah, I
yeah.
just big insight for me.
Yeah, there's all the layers we talked about before that I think like introduce us to what happens at the cosmic layer as a like the ultimate like or the raw version of the pattern that we see at all the other layers. So like the dogs revolting, the like other cities revolting, like all of that is an image of the flood, is an image of what's below taking over what's above, because also what's above tried to go too high, take something too high,
Yeah,
or let itself go down too low. Those things are really the same. So yeah, um, don't have much more to add. I think that was well done.
yeah, um, yeah. I think, and I wanted to mention too that this is like the negative aspect. I think that's something I wanted to make pretty clear too. Like, not all revolution is bad because you can have a good revolution, right? Like on an individual level, um, you break the habit. You're in some bad habit. I don't just take a pick. You're in some bad habit, and then you set out to break that habit and overturn that. That there's a good example of a revolution, and you could probably do the same exercise with something else. But I think this is also kind of me talking about just that small good aspect of revolution. This is how the framing. This is how symbolism is helpful because I have a story. I can think it through. I can see all those patterns. Um, Now, whenever I'm in my life, I can see where, oh, well, revolution, I need a flood in this particular area of my life. I need to do something different because um, it's improper, right? And so once you kind of get a handle on that, then you can use that to really help you navigate things, and uh, it's just a good way to draw your attention to the right things in your life, I think.
Yeah, the I didn't think to bring it up. I think because I sort of become accustomed to think of revolution as distinct from reform, something that Jonathan and I talked about on the French podcast. But I
Okay.
like the way you put the distinction, and it depends on how you want to use the words. I
Reform's a
don't,
good way to say it. Yeah.
yeah, like reform is because then it's nice that you have a word for like the negative version of a reform is a revolution, Or if you succeed in a revolution, it was not really a revolution. You were still connected to something higher, and then it was a reform towards like whatever form you were trying to
Right.
reestablish. I liked the way that Jonathan put it, but I wouldn't have like a big like hesitation to granting someone to use the words whichever way they want, as long as I know what they mean. Um,
Yeah.
but like a good way of putting it that Jonathan told me was if you do a revolution, then you're trying to take something higher for yourself.
Mhm.
But if you reform, you accept to break something at a lower layer, but to reestablish something higher at
Right.
another level. So, and then Jonathan said, go ahead.
Well, I think reform's a good word too, because you're forming again, right? Your intent is to get back to the pre-existing form. Something else is, it's accrued too much, and you have to,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, it's a good word for it. Yeah,
yeah. Whereas the word revolution seems to imply just like flipping things. So,
yeah,
it's or I mean, revolution, I guess could be like doing a complete cycle. So at best, like you come back to where you were before. But reform does imply, I think linguistically, it makes sense.
yeah.
Um, and then it's nice because you can talk about reform in a also fractal way. So whenever as you said, if you try to break a bad habit, you try to reestablish a higher pattern. So I don't, you have let's say a gambling problem, then that's something you want to uproot and you want to establish a higher pattern where whatever tendencies you had, things that were bringing you to gamble, then you try to bring them up into a higher pattern to reestablish a good individual psychology, to reestablish your family relationships or all those things. But at a higher level, whenever the church like convenes to do a council, let's say, and they see, okay, like we have these new problems that happened, but we want to keep the purpose of the church. Like, let's say people are squandering during the first few centuries about how what's the nature of Christ and the relationship between humanity and divinity. Then like you have this problem, but you have the purpose that in Christianity, humanity and divinity must be united. So for
Right.
that purpose, you end up like establishing dogmas, new vocabulary, and so on. That is gonna reform the church into something that can aim for its actual purpose. So that would be a reform. But if you like make big theological changes and found your own church and start anointing your own priest, let's say like Luther did, then that
Yeah,
becomes a revolution rather than a reform.
yeah. I also think too. I had a lot of trouble. Well, I struggle with like finding a good balance between intaking like political content in a healthy way. And uh, one of the things that this kind of framing has been helpful is like um, most of the time when you're trying to solve a problem, at least like for me, I'm not like a politician or I'm not involved in politics or, if you're not in any kind of like super leadership position, like the individual level is a good place to start and stay because I, other than like going vote, I don't really have much of uh, I don't have a much capacity to be able to make a reform at the social political level, but at the individual level, there is something, an immediate effect I can do. And then typically, if you can fix something at the individual level, then that works upward too. Because if I solve my habit of, playing video games too much and being distracted, not playing with my kids, then suddenly if I can get that habit under control, my family benefits because I have more attention to be able to give them. And then if they have more attention, it just kind of then it kind of goes up the stacks. So I think
Yeah.
I want to encourage people to do that because it's a really tough struggle, especially nowadays when we've got so much content coming from so many different ways that that's one of these reasons I like Jordan Peterson a lot. Clean your room is really good advice. Something you can handle, and then if you can handle those things, then if you encounter Artemis and Diana, you might not get turned into a stag and eaten by dogs. So
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting to bring that up because there's a way in which when you try to do the things correctly at your layer, you will have like unanticipated positive contributions to the other layers. So when you
Yeah,
stumble upon those, it's going to be positive. But if you don't do the things correctly at your layer, you might stumble upon something at a higher level that is bad. So let's say, as you said earlier, like if you do things well in your family, then other families will probably notice. It might inspire others. So, for instance, I think a something that I hear a lot these days is the fact that lots of people just don't have good role models. They don't have let's say, images of families that actually all together and couples that don't divorce and kids that are happy and so on. So I know young people who become very inspired and it can have a pretty big impact on their lives just to see examples of families that actually work. Like it's possible. It might be enough to change like many other families and have an impact at the social layer. So let's say you were just doing something individual, like or like familiar within your own level, but you end up stumbling upon things at a higher level, but in a positive way. Not what you see in Actaeon.
yeah, and yeah, it really is. It's something I have to constantly remind myself about. I wish I always had that attitude toward everything. I could think about it, but I think it really does. It's a really healthier way to kind of deal with those things. And yeah, I think that's part of humility too. Like even Moses, we were talking about Moses earlier. Like knowing at which level you're at. Um, yeah. I mean, we all have the idea of like you got to strive and do the best you can. Yeah, you certainly do want to be the best you can at whatever it is you're trying to do. But um, there's certain acknowledgments and humility you have to have of like, well, where am I really, and what do I have the capacity to do in that area, and then doing that as well as you can, until you're ready.
Yeah, perfect. I think that's a good place to end. Maybe to wrap it up, I know
Sure.
you're an artist as well, so maybe there's some things you want to plug before we leave.
I have an Instagram that people can follow me at. I'm pretty active on it. I have a Substack that I do write very infrequently on, and I do sell like some T-shirt designs and things like that. All that can be found on. I have uh, a link to a link tree that I can give you later. People can check it out.
Yeah,
Got some cool stuff.
I'll I'll put it in the description for sure. So yeah, thanks again, David, for coming on. Everyone, check out the article. As I said, I think it's a good thing to keep at the back of your mind when interpreting stories. It's a good example of how to do it. And that's it. Thanks again, David.
Thank you, JP.